Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the ribcage of the rainless night, the frequency of the spill, the toll of the glass gust, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The ribcage of the rainless night. I am standing here now, leaning against a row of humming dryers, trying to find the words to describe what happened at 3:04 a.m. Most people think of a laundromat as a place of rhythmic monotony, the steady thrum of tumbling cotton and the scent of lemon-scented steam. But at 3 in the morning, when the streetlights outside dim and the city holds its breath, the silence becomes heavy enough to feel like weight. It was during one of these stretches that I first noticed the sound. There were no drafts, no open windows, and certainly no breeze, yet a set of wind chimes began to sing from the far corner near the folding tables. They weren't the melodic, soothing chimes you find in a garden. They were sharp, metallic, and slightly discordant. Each note felt like a needle prick against my eardrums. I looked toward them, expecting to see a decoration hanging from the ceiling, but the space was empty. Then I heard it again, a rapid, fluttering trill that seemed to follow the rhythm of a heartbeat. I moved closer, and that is when the air began to change. It grew thick, smelling faintly of wet pavement and old copper. From behind a stack of wicker baskets, something emerged. It didn't walk so much as it unfolded itself into existence. At first, I thought it was just a collection of discarded objects, a heap of broken umbrella ribs gathered on the floor. But then they began to move with intent. The entity was a skeletal structure of blackened wood and curved wire, joined together by invisible joints. It had no face in the traditional sense, but rather a central hub from which dozens of jagged ribs radiated outward like the skeleton of an opening flower. As it moved toward me, I realized its peculiar nature. Every time I took a step forward, it expanded. When it was 10 feet away, it was small enough to fit inside a laundry basket. At 5 feet, it bloomed wider, its ribs stretching until they nearly brushed my shoulders. It made that same chime-like sound as it moved, each rib striking against another with a hollow clink. I felt a sudden urge to back away, but the entity seemed to pulse with a hungry curiosity. It didn't just want to occupy space, it wanted to encompass me. The sound became frantic, a shimmering chorus of metal on wood. I found myself paralyzed as it moved into my personal space, its ribs unfolding until they were so wide that they formed a cage around my torso. It was towering now, a massive canopy of curves and points. I could feel the cold surface of the ribs pressing against my chest, some smooth and polished, others rough with peeling paint. There was no center to it, no heart to see, just the constant, beautiful expansion. It reached its maximum width, the ribs splayed out like a crown of thorns surrounding my head. For a moment, the world was nothing but the sound of those chimes, vibrating against my own skin. I realized then that it wasn't just a shape, it was an appetite for volume. It had opened itself completely to hold me within its architecture. The humming of the dryers suddenly died, as if the machines were holding their breath in respect. The entity stayed perfectly still, every rib locked into place, framing my body in a skeleton of geometry. I took a deep breath, and for the first time since it appeared, there was silence. It didn't shrink back down. Instead, the ribs began to vibrate with a low hum that felt like a purr in my bones. Then, the sound returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just ringing, it was weeping. A single rib at the very top bowed downward, pointing directly at my nose like a finger. I realized then that it had finished opening. It was waiting for me to provide something to fill its wide, hollow center. As I reached out to touch one of the curved edges, the ribs suddenly jerked inward by a fraction of an inch, as if the entity were taking a microscopic breath. I stood there in the fluorescent light, held in that wooden cage, knowing that it wasn't just looking at me. It was waiting for me to become part of its structure. The frequency of the spill. 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 3 seconds. The asphalt ends here. Beyond the last flickering street lamp, the high desert stretches out like a frozen ocean of dust and sagebrush. My headlights cut twin tunnels into the gloom, revealing nothing but the vastness. 2 hours, 16 minutes, and 45 seconds, I see it now. A solitary structure perched on a ridge like a lonely sentinel. the radar station. It is miles from any town, yet its skeletal dome seems to hum with a low, physical vibration that vibrates in my teeth. 2 hours, 20 minutes, and 12 seconds, entering the station's lobby. The air smells of ozone and old copper. The silence here isn't empty. It feels heavy, as if the atmosphere itself is pressing against my skin. I find a small radio on a mahogany table, its dial set to a frequency that shouldn't have anything but static. 2 hours, 22 minutes, and 30 seconds. The static breaks. It's not white noise. It's a rhythmic, wet pulsing sound. Then, a voice rich and smooth as velvet cuts through the hum. "This next piece is for you, Elias," the host says. My name. I freeze. There are no people in this station but me. 2 hours, 25 minutes, and 15 seconds. The music begins. It's a haunting cello melody. As it plays, I notice a movement on the far wall. A drip of ink-colored substance appears near the ceiling. It doesn't fall down, it moves upward. It is a spill of dark, viscous fluid that behaves like water poured into an upside-down glass. It clings to the plaster, racing toward the floor with a rhythmic, bubbling crawl. 2 hours, 30 minutes, and 40 seconds. The cello music fades into a soft piano trill. A bit of a slow one for a lonely traveler, the voice purrs. I hope you find the rhythm satisfying. 2 hours, 35 minutes, and 12 seconds. I stand up, my chair scraping against the stone floor. The spill has grown. It is no longer just on the wall. It is migrating across the ceiling like a rising tide of shadow. It moves with a strange, jerky fluidity, not a smooth flow, but a series of rapid, miniature leaps. It leaves a trail of shimmering, oily residue that catches the light of my flashlight. 2 hours, 42 minutes, and 55 seconds. The radio crackles again. A heavy violin suite begins. You're watching the way it moves, aren't you? The host asks. I turn my head. The spill is now halfway across the room. It isn't just moving, it is expanding. Every time a note of the violin hits a high peak, the dark fluid pulses outward, sending ripples through its own surface like a stone tossed into a pond. 2 hours, 50 minutes, and 18 seconds. The station feels smaller. The spill has reached the center of the room and began to pool in midair, suspended by some unseen gravity. It looks like a floating globule of midnight, thick enough to hold its shape, but thin enough to see through. It is reaching for me now. 2 hours, 58 minutes, and 33 seconds. The music swells into a crescendo. The finale, the voice whispers, sounding as if it were standing right behind my ear. I don't turn around, because I can feel the temperature drop. The spill isn't just on the walls anymore. It is falling upward from every surface simultaneously. It pours off the table, off the chairs, and off the floor, converging into a single mass in front of my face. And 3 hours, 5 minutes, and 12 seconds. I reach out to touch it. My fingers sink into the cool, heavy dark. It doesn't feel like water. It feels like velvet submerged in oil. As my hand enters the spill, the radio emits one final, piercing note of a flute. 3 hours and 10 minutes. The host speaks one last time, his voice devoid of its previous warmth. And finally, this one is for the person who stayed until the end. 3 hours, 12 minutes, and 45 seconds. The music stops. The spill suddenly flattens against my skin, coating my arm in a layer of perfect, dry darkness. I look at the wall where it originated. It is completely empty now, but the radio is still humming with a faint, hungry vibration. 3 hours, 15 minutes, and 20 seconds. I realize there are no more songs left to play, yet the host's voice begins again, though there is no music this time. Stay a while, he says. I've been waiting for someone to fill my silence. 3 hours and 18 minutes. I look down at my hand. The dark spill isn't just on my skin. It has begun to seep under my pores, slowly turning my flesh into the same ink-colored substance that climbed the walls, and I can feel its weight pulling me toward the ceiling. The toll of the glass guest. Voice log entry, 2:14 a.m. Command, identify all residents in the hallway. Response, there are 3 people in the hallway. One is standing by the door, one is sitting on the floor, and one is currently looking at you. I stared at the display of my voice assistant hub, blinking in the gloom of the toll booth. I was alone. The city bridge stretched out into a void of midnight blue, humming with the vibration of distant traffic. There were no other residents. Yet, the log recorded 3. I brushed it off as a glitch of the humidity. Voice log entry, 2:30 a.m. Command, who is sitting on the floor? Response, the one with the velvet collar. I looked down at the concrete floor where my chair sat. It was empty. There was no velvet collar, no occupant, just the dust of 1,000 passing tires. I felt a slight draft, though the windows were sealed tight against the wind. Voice log entry, 2:45 a.m. Command, is the door closed? Response, the door is closed, but the guest is leaning against it. I stood up and walked toward the heavy oak door at the back of the booth. It was shut firm. But as I looked into the tall, rectangular mirror hanging beside it, my breath hitched. The hallway and the reflection didn't match the physical space. In the mirror, the walls were melting like wax, the ceiling drooping and streaking with colors that shouldn't exist. Everything inside the glass was a smear of motion. The floor looked like a watercolor painting left in the rain. But there, standing against the door, was the guest. The guest was not smeared. Its outline was razor-sharp, as if it had been cut out of reality with a pair of heavy shears. It possessed a torso made of hammered copper and skin that looked like toasted porcelain. Instead of hair, a crown of jagged glass shards protruded from its scalp, catching the dim light of the booth. It didn't have eyes. Instead, its face featured 2 perfectly round indentations filled with crushed garnets. Voice log entry, 3:12 a.m. Command, why is the guest moving? Response, the guest is walking toward you. Its footsteps are silent. In the mirror, the guest moved. It didn't walk like a human. It glided with a jerky, stop-motion grace. As it stepped into the center of the reflection, I realized that while its edges were crisp, its internal details were constantly shifting. Its copper torso rippled like liquid metal, and the garnet pits on its face pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heat. I looked back at the physical hallway. It was still empty. The mirror was the only place where the guest lived. I felt a sudden, sharp chill on my shoulder, as if something were breathing on my neck. Voice log entry, 3:45 a.m. Command, how far away is it? Response, it is close enough to touch your shadow. I didn't dare turn around. I kept my eyes locked on the glass. The guest was now standing directly in front of my reflection. In the mirror, its porcelain face was inches from mine. I could see the tiny cracks in its skin and the way the light danced off the glass crown. It raised a hand, a solid, geometric block of bronze, and pressed it against the surface of the mirror from the inside. Voice log entry, 4:02 a.m. Command, is it reaching out? Response, it is waiting for you to let go. I reached out my own hand, trembling. My fingers touched the cool glass at the exact spot where the guest's bronze hand rested. For a second, the smear of the mirrored hallway stopped moving. The melting walls froze into solid pillars of amber and violet. Then, the copper torso of the guest hummed, a low frequency that vibrated in my teeth. Voice log entry, 4:15 a.m. Command, swap places. Response, execution complete. I felt a violent tug at my chest, a sensation of being pulled through a needle's eye. The world inverted. The solid booth became the smear. The floor became a watercolor wash. I felt my own skin begin to stretch and soften, my limbs losing their hard edges until they were streaks of motion against the background. I looked up, standing in the physical hallway. Now was the guest, its copper body gleaming under the fluorescent light, its glass crown chiming like tiny bells. It reached out and touched the mirror, which was now my world. Voice log entry, 4:20 a.m. Command, is there anyone left? Response, there is one person left in the booth, but they are very blurry. The guest at the table. Frequently asked questions regarding my tenure as the night watchman of level 10. Question, is it normal for a parking garage to feel this large when there are no cars? A, it is not. At midnight, the concrete pillars seem to stretch toward the sky like ribs of a giant skeleton. The silence isn't just an absence of sound. It is a weight that presses against your eardrums until you can hear your own pulse thrumming in your teeth. Question, why does the chair move every morning? A, That is the mystery I first encountered. Every morning at 6 a.m., when I walk onto the top level to begin my rounds, there is a single wooden chair placed perfectly in the center of the empty concrete floor. It isn't just sitting there, it is pulled out from an invisible table, angled toward the far corner where the shadows are thickest. On Monday, it faced north. On Tuesday, it faced southeast. Each day, it sits as if waiting for a guest who never arrives. Question: what happens when I try to sit in the chair? A. The first week, I was bold. I sat down to rest my aching legs and felt a sudden, sharp intake of air beside me. It wasn't a breeze. It was as if something had exhaled. The moment my weight hit the wood, the temperature plummeted. A faint, rhythmic vibration started in the floorboards, a thrumming like a heartbeat buried deep underground. Question: is there actually someone sitting there with me? A. I can never be certain of its shape, but I can feel its presence. It is not a ghost of flesh and bone. It is a collection of textures held together by dozens of thick, tan rubber bands. It looks like a cluster of wet velvet spheres joined by these elastic loops. When it moves, the bands stretch and snap with the sound of tiny pebbles clicking against glass. Question: why does it react to my breathing? A. This is the most unsettling part. The entity doesn't just watch me, it reacts to the very rhythm of my lungs. Every time I take a breath in, its form flinches inward. It pulls its velvet spheres toward its center as if trying to become smaller, more compact. When I hold my breath, it remains perfectly still, suspended in a state of tension. When I exhale, it relaxes just enough for the rubber bands to hum. Question: can you describe its face? A. It has no true nose or chin. Instead, where a face should be, there is a single large sphere of coarse burlap texture, held by 6 heavy bands that pull it into a permanent expression of mild surprise. It doesn't have a mouth in the traditional sense. Rather, it has a series of small slits along its side that widen whenever I think of something sad. And question: does it ever move on its own? A. Rarely. Most nights, it stays anchored to the chair. But last Tuesday, during a particularly heavy thunderstorm, I found the chair had moved 3 feet to the left. The entity was no longer facing the corner, it was facing me. It stayed perfectly still as I watched, but its rubber bands were vibrating so fast they became a blur of motion. Question: is it getting closer? A. Every night, the chair moves 1 inch closer to the center of the floor. And every night, the entity seems to be leaning further forward. It is no longer just waiting, it is reaching. Its velvet spheres are beginning to droop toward the seat of the chair as if it is growing weary of its own weight. Question: what did you see last night? A. Last night was different. I didn't want to sit down, but the silence was too heavy to ignore. I sat in the chair, and for the first time, it reached out a cluster of spheres toward my hand. It didn't touch me, not yet. It just hovered an inch away, the rubber bands groaning under the tension of its reach. Question: are you still afraid to go back up there? A. I am not afraid of the chair anymore. I am afraid of what happens when the chair is finally full. Last night, as I turned to leave at 6 a.m., I saw the entity's burlap face leaning toward my ear. It didn't make a sound, but the rubber bands gave one final, synchronized snap. When I looked back, the chair was empty, but there was a single, wet velvet sphere resting on the seat where its head had been, still pulsing with a faint warmth. The exhale of the closet. I should have stopped after the first night, but my daughter insisted on hearing it. Now, every time I tuck her in, I find myself repeating the same sequence of words, watching her eyes widen as the rhythm of the mountain wind settles into a steady hum. We were stationed at Outpost 9, a relay tower perched on a jagged peak where the clouds felt heavy enough to touch. The ice storm didn't just fall, it swallowed us. For 3 days, the world was a white void, sealing our small wooden cabin against the howling exterior. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and burnt wax. There were 4 of us, me, my wife, our daughter, and a heavy silence that seemed to live in the corners of the ceiling. The house was cozy until it wasn't. It started on the second night when the wind died down completely. In that vacuum of sound, I noticed the closet in the hallway. It was a simple thing of oak and iron hinges, but as the house went still, it began to breathe. Not a rhythmic puff of air, but a heavy, moist exhale that felt like a sigh from a deep lung. "Did you hear that?" my wife whispered into the dark. I nodded, feeling the vibration in the floorboards. Then came the shadow. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a second version of myself, yet fundamentally wrong. It didn't move with me. It anticipated me. When I reached for a cup on the table, its hand was already there, gripping the handle a fraction of a second before my own fingers touched the porcelain. It had no face, just a smooth surface of deep indigo velvet that rippled like water. Instead of hands, it possessed 3 jointed limbs on each side of its torso, moving with a fluid, underwater grace. The most unsettling part was its presence. It was always 1 heartbeat ahead. If I stepped into the kitchen, the shadow was already standing by the stove. It didn't walk. It slid through the air like a drop of ink spreading across wet paper. As the days passed, the shadow grew bolder. It began to mimic my posture, but with a slight delay in its expression. When I sat down, it reclined. When I frowned, its velvet surface folded inward into a crease of concentration. But as we huddled deeper into the ice storm, the closet became the focal point of our dread. Every time the house fell perfectly quiet, every time the voices stopped and the wind paused, the closet would exhale again. Each breath was louder than the last. It sounded like air escaping from a massive, leather bellows submerged in water. "It's getting closer," I told my daughter on the final night. The shadow had grown larger, its indigo body stretching until it touched both walls of the hallway. It no longer waited for me to move. It was beginning to lead me. I would feel a tug at the back of my neck, a subtle pull toward the closet, as if something were beckoning me forward. On the 7th night, the storm peaked and then vanished, leaving us in a tomb of frozen white. We lay in bed, barely daring to blink. The house was silent. Then, the closet exhaled. It wasn't a sigh this time. It was a deep, resonant groan that shook the dust from the rafters. "Open it," my wife breathed. I stood up, my knees trembling. The shadow moved first, its 3 limbs unfolding like a blooming flower as it drifted toward the oak door. I reached out, my hand shaking, and gripped the iron handle. The shadow's velvet body pressed against my shoulder, feeling like cool silk. With a sharp intake of breath from the room itself, I pulled the door open. Inside, there was no mountain gear, no coats, no boots. There was only the shadow, standing perfectly still, its indigo surface glowing with a faint, internal light. It didn't jump out. It simply waited for me to see it. Then, as I watched, the shadow leaned forward and pressed its smooth face against mine. In that moment, the closet gave one final, violent exhale, pushing everything out into the room. The shadow merged into my own chest, becoming a permanent part of my ribcage. Now, when I walk through a room, I feel it shifting beneath my skin, waiting for me to move so it can be there first. When I finally sat down in the chair this morning and let the house go completely silent, I felt the shadow twitch against my heart. Then, from the empty closet behind me, a new voice whispered my name, using a pitch that was perfectly identical to mine. "The passenger of the Switchbacks. Entry 14:02 and 14 seconds AM. Movement detected in nursery A." I woke up to the sound of a rhythmic, wet pulse coming through the speaker, not quite a heartbeat, but more like the muffled thrum of a heavy lung expanding against silk. The nursery was empty of people, yet the monitor insisted something was there. It felt as though my house had become a hollow shell, and I was merely a tiny, frantic thought flickering inside the mind of a titan that hadn't yet opened its eyes. The silence of the room was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. In this stillness, the memories of our journey began to surface unbidden and sharp as shards of flint. The coach train we took up into the mountains last night haunted me in this silence. I remember sitting in the carriage, feeling the rhythmic lurch of the switchbacks. Every time the wheels groaned against the iron, the world felt like it was being swallowed by something immense. It wasn't just a train moving through a landscape. It felt as if the mountain itself were a sleeping beast, and we were small sparks of consciousness traveling through its velvet veins. The air in the carriage had been thick with the scent of pine resin and cold iron. I closed my eyes for 1 second to steady myself against the tilt, a momentary surrender to gravity. When they snapped open, the carriage was different. The seat across from me wasn't empty anymore. It held a shape that moved only in those stolen fragments of darkness. It didn't have the grace of a human or the simplicity of an animal. It possessed something more ethereal, a haunting middle ground. It had a deer-gated posture, high-set shoulders, a neck that seemed to curve with elegant tension, and limbs that ended in broad, velvet-soft pads rather than toes. Its body was covered in fur the color of toasted oatmeal, textured like crushed suede, which seemed to absorb the dim light of the flickering lamps. When I blinked, it was 10 feet away, its muzzle grazing the floor. When I closed my eyes again, it was inches from my face, its nostrils flared as if inhaling my very breath. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had 3 vertical slits along its snout that pulsed with light, like lanterns buried deep beneath skin. The train continued to climb into the jagged peaks, and I realized the entity wasn't just a passenger. It was a part of the slumbering giant. Every time the coach dipped into a valley or crested a ridge, the creature shifted, reacting to the mountain's dreams. It moved in those half seconds of my blinks, a strobe light existence that defied the laws of constant motion. I would see it lurch forward with a hoof-like strike, then watch it vanish into the shadows of its own stillness the moment I looked at it directly. It was as if it existed only when the observer wasn't watching, a ghost of motion in a world of static observation. By the time we reached the summit, I felt less like a traveler and more like a single neuron firing in a massive, dreaming brain. The creature was my companion in that thought. It didn't speak, but it communicated through these sudden leaps of position. One blink, it stood by the window, its tail twitching like a pendulum against the glass. Next blink, it was draped over the luggage rack, its fur shimmering with an iridescent sheen as if it were made of woven moonlight. Finally, as we reached the peak and the train leveled out into a long, flat stretch, I felt a surge of profound loneliness. It was as if the giant were beginning to stir, and my tiny thought was about to be merged into something larger. Back in the present, the nursery monitor caught it at the very end. In the final seconds before I drifted off, there was a sound of soft, velvet pads hitting the hardwood floor, a muffled thump pad that vibrated through the floorboards. The creature had entered the room while I wasn't looking. It didn't just stand in the corner. It stood right over my crib, its 3 slits glowing with a low, amber hum that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. It reached out with a wide, flat paw and touched the railing. It was waiting for me to blink one last time so it could finally show me its true form. I didn't want to open my eyes. I knew that if I did, the mountain would no longer be dreaming, it would be watching. And as the hum grew louder, a cold weight settled on the edge of my mattress, heavy and deliberate. The nursery was silent again, but the monitor flickered with a final, frantic pulse of light. The geometry of the missing step. Patient history. The subject arrived at St. Jude's Clinic of Perceptual Anomalies following a 3-hour delay in Terminal 4 of the Central Transit Hub. While most travelers slept, the subject remained awake in Gate 12, which was scheduled to be decommissioned for the night. The terminal was an expanse of linoleum and fluorescent humming, largely vacant except for a single plastic chair and a discarded suitcase. Patient narrative. I thought it would be peaceful, being alone in a space designed for thousands. The lights were dimmed to a dull amber, and the air smelled of ozone and floor wax. My phone was dead until I pulled it from my pocket at 2:14 a.m. When I pressed the video call button, expecting nothing but a blank feed, the screen flickered to life. It wasn't just any camera. It felt as though the room itself had developed an eye. At first, there was only the grainy texture of the empty gate ahead of me. Then, the frame shifted. In the far corner, where my eyes insisted there was nothing but a flat wall, a shape began to resolve. It was the missing stair, that phantom architecture I had felt in my dreams since childhood, the one my feet knew existed even when my vision failed to confirm it. It appeared on the screen as a jagged, iridescent fracture in reality. It wasn't a solid object so much as a fold in the air, textured like hammered copper and shimmering with a pearlescent oily sheen. It looked like a step that had been forgotten by the architect of the world. On the video call, it pulsed. As I watched the screen, my physical eyes saw only the flat, white wall of the terminal, but the phone revealed the truth. A staircase of impossible geometry was unfolding in midair. "Is someone there?" I whispered to the empty gate. The video feed responded. The missing stair didn't just sit there. It began to descend into the room. It wasn't falling. It was unfolding like a pleated fan made of velvet and glass. Each step was a different shade of violet, and they moved with a rhythmic, clicking sound that resonated in my teeth rather than my ears. As the staircase extended toward my chair, the video call began to lag. The image stuttered, but every time it smoothed out, the stair had moved closer. It wasn't just a physical structure, it was hungry. I realized then why my feet always remembered it. My body knew that when you walk into this specific patch of empty air, you don't land on the floor, you drop into the hidden sequence of steps. I reached out a hand toward the screen. In my reality, my fingers touched nothing but cold air. On the screen, my fingers brushed against the velvet edge of the third step from the top. The stair began to vibrate, sending ripples through the terminal's atmosphere like a stone dropped in a still pond. Then, the most unsettling shift occurred. A presence emerged from the fold. It wasn't a creature with limbs and a face, but a cluster of floating, geometric shards that hummed in unison. They were pieces of the stair that had broken off during its long sleep in the subconscious. They drifted toward me like schools of fish, weaving between my legs. One shard, shaped like a jagged diamond and glowing with a soft amber light, bumped against my knee. "Don't let it finish," I muttered to myself, though I didn't know who was listening. On the video call, the stair began to expand rapidly, its violet steps multiplying until they filled the entire gate area. It was no longer a hidden secret. It was an invasion. The hum grew into a low, vibrating thrum that made the plastic chair rattle against the linoleum. I felt my feet begin to lift off the ground, instinctively seeking the grip of a step that wasn't there. I watched the screen as the stair reached its final expansion. It didn't just occupy the space, it replaced it. The wall was gone. The floor was gone. There was only the infinite, clicking descent of violet velvet and hammered copper. I realized then that the stair wasn't something you looked at, it was something you fell into. I gripped the arms of my chair as the gravity shifted. My toes found purchase on a step that felt like cold silk. The video feed flickered one last time, showing the entire terminal transformed into a vertical labyrinth of glowing geometry. I took one step forward, feeling the familiar pull of the phantom height. Discharge instructions. The patient is advised to avoid returning to Terminal 4 at night. While the stair is currently anchored in Gate 12, it remains active. It is no longer just a memory or a hidden fold. It has established a permanent foothold. When you return to that gate, do not look for the stairs with your eyes alone. Your feet will know exactly where they are, and once you take that first step, the ground of the world you know will simply fall away. The weight of the upward fall. I am standing in a concrete tomb, 400 feet below the surface of the earth. It is my job to watch the great silence. For 3 months, I have lived inside this Cold War missile silo, a cylindrical cathedral of steel and humming electronics. My task is simple: maintain the rhythm of the machinery, ensure the nuclear heart remains beating, and keep the silence from becoming too heavy. But last Tuesday, during the deepest part of the night shift, the silence began to feel less like an absence of sound and more like a presence of weight. I was sitting on the gallery, leaning against a rusted railing, looking up at the circular opening at the top of the silo. Because of the geometry of the structure, the sky doesn't look like it's above you. It looks like it's pulling you into it. They call it the upward fall, the sensation that if you stare at the stars for too long, gravity forgets to pull you down and starts to drag your soul toward the zenith. I felt my shoulders loosen, my spine stretching as if my vertebrae were trying to unspool like a ribbon caught in a breeze. The further I looked into the velvet blackness of the cosmos, the more my stomach lurched, not with the drop of a fall, but with the steady, dizzying tug of rising. Then I heard it. It started as a faint thrum against the concrete floor, a rhythmic pulse that wasn't the machinery. It was a footstep, a single, heavy tread. I froze. The silo was vast, and there should have been no one else here but me. I took a breath, my own heartbeat echoing in my chest, and then it happened again. Tap. Then, a split second later, 2 taps. It wasn't just an echo, it was a mimic. My brain registered my own foot hitting the floor as a ghost note, followed by its double. A set of footsteps was walking with me, but it was gaining ground in a strange, mathematical way. Every time I moved, the entity took one more step than I did. 1, 2, 2, 3. It was weaving a pattern of movement that felt intentional, as if it were trying to catch up to my very existence. I stood up and began to walk toward the central launch pad. With every stride I took, I heard its response. Thump thump. The sound wasn't coming from directly behind me. It sounded like it was coming from the air itself, a vibration in the atmosphere. As I walked, the sensation of falling upward intensified. My hair began to lift toward the ceiling, and my clothes felt lighter, as if the gravity of the earth was losing its grip on my body, while the magnetism of the stars took hold. The footsteps grew louder, faster. Now, for every step I took, it landed 3 beats. Thump, thump, thump. The sound had a texture to it, not the dull thud of leather on stone, but something more resonant, like a hollow gourd being struck by a velvet mallet. It was moving with a frantic, hungry pace now, trying to bridge the gap between us. I could feel the air pressure changing as it moved closer. It wasn't just mimicking my feet, it was mimicking my weight. The floor beneath its invisible feet seemed to groan under a pressure that shouldn't be there. I stopped abruptly. The sound didn't stop immediately. It took 3 distinct, shrinking beats to finally settle into silence. Then came the sound of breath, not a sigh, but a sharp, rhythmic intake of air that sounded like air being sucked through a flute made of bone. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was nothing there, yet the space 5 feet in front of me felt dense, as if someone had pushed a heavy invisible curtain into the room. The sensation of falling upward reached its peak. For a moment, I felt my heels lift off the ground, my body suspended in that perfect middle point between here and there. Then, the entity made its final move. It didn't just mimic one more step. It mimicked a lean. A shadow flickered, not a silhouette of a person, but a ripple in the air, like heat haze over a summer road. It surged forward, closing the distance between us in a single, sweeping motion. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my chest, as if something had grabbed my collar and pulled me toward it. The upward fall became a violent lurch, and, for a second, I wasn't just looking at the stars. I was being dragged into them by a hand that hadn't been there before. The sensation passed as quickly as it arrived, leaving me standing in the center of the silo, perfectly still. The footsteps were gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. I looked down at my boots and saw a dusting of frost on the toes, where something had breathed just moments ago. I realized then that it wasn't trying to catch up to me anymore. It had finally arrived. It is sitting right behind my left shoulder now, waiting for me to look back. The ink-stained audience. Illegible. It began with the silence of the Blackwood Preserve. Most people think of forest silence as a void, but in the off-season, it feels more like a held breath. I was assigned to the ranger station, a squat, timber-framed hut that smelled of cedar and old dust. The park was shuttered, the tourists gone, leaving only the skeletal remains of oaks and pines. At first, the solitude was my greatest ally. Then came the night of the 3rd week when I realized I wasn't actually alone. It started with a faint sound, a rhythmic, wet friction, the noise of something heavy sliding over paper. One evening, while nursing a mug of tea by the hearth, I saw it in the corner of the room, a crowd. They were standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, huddled together like a silent congregation. At first, I thought they were ghosts, but they were far more tactile than that. They were made of wet newspaper, their bodies composed of overlapping sheets of newsprint that rippled and folded as they moved. The texture was matte and damp to the touch, smelling faintly of fresh printing ink and rain. Each creature possessed a face, not a singular face, but a collection of faces printed in bold, jagged typography. There were headlines for brows, subheaders for cheeks, and tiny, frantic body text forming the intricate lines of their mouths. What unsettled me most was that they never blinked. They simply stared with wide, ink-stained eyes that remained perpetually open. Illegible. As the days bled into one another, the crowd grew. They didn't just stand in the corner anymore. They began to migrate. Every time I turned my back to sharpen a tool or check the logs, I could hear the soft shuff thump of paper folding against paper. They would move with a strange, jerky fluidity, like origami coming to life. One night, I found 3 of them sitting at the kitchen table. Their bodies were heavy with moisture, beads of water clinging to the printed letters on their shoulders. One had a face featuring a tragic headline about a lost harvest. Another featured a bold announcement about a distant storm. They didn't speak, but they seemed to lean in toward me, their faces shifting as if reading my own thoughts through the ink. "Are you watching?" One of them seemed to pulse, its mouth moving not by opening, but by the paper slightly wrinkling upward. I realized then that they weren't just inhabitants, they were observers. They lived for the gaze. They gathered in the dark because light made their textures pop, highlighting every crease and every smudge of black ink. Illegible. By the second week of the heavy snows, the station felt cramped. The crowd had filled every available inch of space. They occupied the rafters, hanging like stalactites. They lined the walls, overlapping like a deck of cards. I could no longer walk across the room without brushing against a damp, newsy shoulder. The sensation was peculiar, smooth, slightly tacky, and cold. One morning, I woke to find the largest of them standing directly over my bed. Its body was made of heavy broadsheet paper, folded into thick pleats that looked like muscular ribs. Its face was a masterpiece of journalism. A towering headline about the end of the season served as its primary expression. It didn't move an inch, yet I felt it pressing down on me with its collective weight. Illegible. The most terrifying thing occurred on the final night before my shift ended. A blizzard outside turned the world white, and the station was a warm cocoon of wood and paper. I sat by the window, watching the flakes fall, but when I looked inward, the crowd had changed. They were no longer just standing. They were facing me in perfect unison. Every single one of them, dozens of these wet, printed entities, had turned their faces toward my chair. The room was a symphony of ink and pulp. No one moved. No one blinked. There was only the heavy, humid scent of damp newsprint filling my lungs. I reached out to touch the largest one, its face a chaotic jumble of adjectives. And verbs. As my fingers met the paper, it didn't just sit there, it began to ripple. The ink started to migrate across its surface, the letters crawling like tiny ants toward the center of its brow. Stay, the newspaper hummed, the word forming from a cluster of bold-faced verbs. I stood up to leave, but as I reached for the door handle, every single face in the room turned to follow my hand. They were hungry for the movement, for the change in the narrative. I stepped out into the snow, the heavy door groaning shut behind me. As I walked toward the main gate, the silence of the park returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. From inside the station, I heard a final, collective rustle, the sound of 100 pages turning at once. Even though the door was closed, I could feel them watching from the shadows, waiting for the next story to begin. The last thing I saw before the light faded was a single page pressed against the glass of the window, its headline reading, "The observer is now the observed." The echo in the sub-basement. I am writing this by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, though I find it difficult to hold my pen steady. The laundry room is, well, it is less a room and more of a subterranean cavern at this point. It sits 3 levels below the lobby of the Grand Aurelian, a place where the hum of the steam pipes provides a constant, low-frequency thrum. Most guests never see it, but for me, it has become an inescapable reality since I checked in on Tuesday. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It is unnaturally warm here, even when the machines are off. But that warmth is not constant. It pulses. When I stand perfectly still, when my heart rate slows and my breathing hitches, the air suddenly exhales. It feels like a heavy, humid sigh escaping from a hidden source. I spent the first hour simply moving between the towering baskets of linen. The rhythmic clatter of the dryers was my only companion until I stopped to adjust a heavy woolen blanket. That was when it happened. I held my breath for 3 seconds, and the air pushed against my face, smelling faintly of wet earth and crushed mint. It felt as though a massive lung was expanding just behind the stone wall of the boiler. Then came the sound. I whispered to myself, "Is anyone there?" Before the vibration of my own voice could fully fade from the air, a response returned. But it wasn't an immediate echo. It arrived exactly 1 beat before I expected it, a premature ripple in the silence. And it wasn't my voice. While mine was thin and raspy from the dust, the return was deep and resonant, like a cello string being plucked underwater. "Here," the wall replied. I froze. The sound didn't come from the ceiling or the floor. It seemed to emanate from the very pores of the brickwork. I tried again, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who are you?" "You," the wall answered back. The timing was maddening. The echo always arrived just a fraction of a second before the sound it was mimicking finished its journey in my own ears. It felt like the room was anticipating me, leaning forward to catch my words before I could even finish thinking them. As the night deepened, the warmth became more aggressive. It no longer felt like a gentle sigh. It felt like a hot breath being forced out of a narrow throat. I began to notice the physical manifestations of the thing in the cave. Small patches of the brickwork started to sweat, beads of moisture forming, and then vanishing as if being licked away by an invisible tongue. The steam from the pipes began to curve toward the center of the room, drawn into a vacuum that seemed to exist behind the mortar. I felt small. I felt like a speck of dust in the throat of a sleeping giant. I decided to test it. I walked toward the far corner where the bricks were darkest and most humid. The air there was almost scalding. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the rough surface. It wasn't just warm, it felt soft, like velvet-covered skin. "Hello," I said clearly. "Hello," the wall breathed back. I waited for the second echo to arrive. My pulse skipped. The wall didn't wait for me to finish. It spoke while my own voice was still hanging in the air, overlapping with mine like two ghosts trying to share the same doorway. It was a melodic, humming sound that lacked any human vocal cords, but possessed an undeniable personality. I realized then that the cave wasn't just reacting to me, it was consuming me. Every time I spoke, the echo became slightly more complex. The next time I whispered, "cold," the wall replied with a multi-tonal shimmer of "cold" that sounded like dozens of voices layered on top of one another. I began to feel a strange pressure in my ears. The cave was getting closer. I could see now, or rather, feel now, the way the shadows were stretching toward me. They weren't just cast by the lamp. They were being pulled into the cracks of the bricks like water down a drain. I took a deep breath and spoke my final words to the room. "Are you hungry?" The wall didn't hesitate. The echo arrived before I could even close my mouth, a rich, vibrating rumble that shook the floor beneath my boots. Yes. Then, the warmth suddenly vanished. The air became ice-cold in an instant. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound I had heard all night. I realized then that the echo hadn't just been a reaction. It had been a countdown. The cave had finished its intake of my voice and was now preparing to take the rest of me. I stood there in the sudden frost, staring at the damp bricks. I could no longer hear any humming or feel any heat. But as I prepared to turn and flee toward the stairs, I felt a faint vibration against the back of my neck, a tiny, precise puff of warm air hitting my skin from right behind my ear. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the space just behind my own head. The echo in the foam. "Lord, grant me the grace of motion. Let this shuttle glide through the hollow belly of the terminal, a vessel of transit where time feels suspended in the fluorescent hum. I am alone on these seats, yet the silence is heavy, pressing against my eardrums like water." It began as a prayer for patience, a simple plea whispered to the vaulted ceiling while the shuttle lurched forward without a single passenger to share the weight of the journey. "Please, let the miles pass quickly," I murmured. And then, from the very back of the bus, a space where the shadows pooled like spilled ink, came a reply that wasn't mine. It was a squeak, high-pitched and wet, like a rubber ball bouncing on a marble floor. It sounded as if something were trying to form the word quickly, but could only manage the friction of its own existence. I turned my head, expecting to see a traveler, but found only an empty row. I chuckled softly, my voice vibrating in my chest. "Is someone there?" I asked. The squeak returned instantly, layering itself beneath my own tone, a ghost note following my lead. It was as if the shuttle had developed a secondary pulse, a twin vibration hidden just under the surface of my breath. As we rounded the first bend of the loop, the sensation intensified. Every time I spoke, a second voice emerged from the upholstery, a muffled, rhythmic friction that seemed to be learning my vocabulary. It wasn't a human throat producing it, it was the sound of something textured rubbing against itself. I closed my eyes and began to pray for clarity, my words becoming more deliberate as the shuttle hummed along its endless circuit. Grant me sight to see what hides in the corners, I prayed aloud. Beneath my voice, the entity responded with a sequence of rapid, staccato chirps that mimicked the cadence of sight and corners. It was no longer just following me, it was mimicking the shape of my thoughts. I realized then that the shuttle wasn't just carrying me, it was hosting something. The entity sat in the middle row, a massive, irregular lump of packing foam. It didn't have a face or limbs in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a dense, porous cloud of amber-colored bubbles, some large and sagging, others tiny and tight like pomegranate seeds. It had a velvety texture that seemed to absorb the light, and as it moved, it didn't roll, it squelched and shifted, its surface pores expanding and contracting. I watched as it began to grow, its foam body inflating with every word I uttered. When I spoke, it would pulse, the tiny bubbles on its surface shivering like 1,000 microscopic teeth. Forgive my hesitations, I whispered, my prayer shifting into a confession of the day's anxieties. The foam responded by expanding outward, its squeaks becoming more fluid, less like friction and more like a melody. It was trying to find its own vocabulary, using my words as a scaffold. By the third loop, the shuttle felt crowded despite our solitude. The entity had grown large enough to touch the ceiling, its amber bubbles casting soft shadows across the seats. I stopped praying for strength and started confessing my deepest regrets. I fear the passing of time, I confessed. The foam shuddered, a deep, resonant squeak echoing through the floorboards, followed by a series of rapid clicks that sounded like a frantic heart trying to find its beat. It was molding itself into my emotions. Every time I admitted a flaw, it grew a new texture, a jagged ridge here, a smooth crater there. It was no longer just a mass of foam. It was a physical manifestation of the words I threw at it. The air began to smell of old paper and toasted grain. As we entered the final loop, the silence of the terminal seemed to deepen, as if the building itself were holding its breath. My voice grew tired, my prayers fading into a low hum of exhaustion. I am here, I said finally, a simple statement of existence. The foam reacted with a violent, joyous expansion, its bubbles vibrating so fast they blurred into a golden haze. It reached out, not with fingers, but with a soft, sprawling wave of porous weight and brushed against my shoulder. It didn't just squeak then. It vibrated with a resonance that felt like a hum in my very bones. For a moment, the two voices became indistinguishable, my human tone and its foam friction merging into one singular vibration. I closed my eyes, feeling the entity settle into the seat beside me, heavy and warm. The shuttle slowed to a crawl as it reached the final terminal gate. I took a deep breath, ready to step off into the light of the waiting lobby. But before my foot could touch the floor, the foam gave one last, definitive squeak, a sound so perfect it captured the exact pitch of my own name. I opened my eyes to find that while I had been speaking, the entity had been copying more than just my words. It had been stealing the very air from my lungs. As I stepped onto the platform, I felt a small, dry piece of foam flake off its side and land on my palm. It didn't fall like dust. It stayed there, vibrating with a tiny, lingering squeak as if waiting for me to speak again. The jingle in the iron tank. I found the phone on my bedside table the morning after I moved into the farmhouse. It was a heavy, archaic slab of brass and glass with no brand name, but it vibrated with a persistent, low-frequency hum. When I picked it up, there were no messages, only a missed call list that refused to be cleared. Every time I tried to swipe away the entries, they reappeared instantly. The first caller was the tower. It had called once, 3 nights ago. The second call came 2 nights ago. The third call arrived last night. Each time, The time of the call moved closer to the present moment. The house sat on a vast, flat prairie where the wind usually carried the scent of toasted grass, but tonight, it was silent. Above the porch stood the water tower, a rusted, iron giant that loomed over the horizon like a hollow skull. It hadn't held water for decades. Its belly was empty, save for the shadows that pooled inside its curved ribs. On the first night of my stay, I heard it from the far edge of the property, a faint, tinny jingle. It was the melody of an ice cream truck, 3 notes of rising warmth followed by a lingering hum. It felt out of place in the wilderness, yet it didn't seem to come from a vehicle. It felt as if the air itself were vibrating with the tune. On the second night, I sat on the porch steps and listened. The jingle was louder. It wasn't just sound. It carried a physical weight, like a soft pulse against my skin. I looked up at the water tower. A faint, amber glow began to leak from its iron mouth. On the third night, the jingle came from the backyard. I could see the source now, a flickering radiance emanating from the base of the tower. As I stepped into the yard, the temperature plummeted. The prairie grass turned brittle and white with frost, as if touched by a sudden exhale. In the center of that coldness sat a creature. It was not a ghost or a man. It looked like a cluster of floating, translucent lanterns joined together by ribbons of shimmering silk. Its body was a sphere of pulsing honey-gold light, and instead of limbs, it had dozens of delicate, fluttering veils that rippled in the wind. It didn't have a face, but where a head should be, there was a spinning core of heat that radiated like a dying star. When I saw it, the jingle played clearly, ding low high. The creature drifted toward me, and as it moved, the frost on the grass retreated. It was feeding. It didn't eat my food or my thoughts. It inhaled my warmth. As it drew near, my breath hitched in a cloud of steam, and the heat from my shoulders seemed to flow into its glowing core like water into a sponge. On the fourth night, the jingle came from the porch. The creature was closer. It moved with a fluid, balletic grace, its silk veils trailing behind it like wet lace. It didn't walk, it drifted, leaving a trail of melted dew in the frost. I realized then that the water tower wasn't just its home, it was its pantry. By the fifth night, the jingle was right beside my chair. The creature hovered inches from my face. Its core pulsed with a violent, rhythmic heat. It was no longer honey gold. It had turned a deep, fiery orange, drinking in the warmth of my body until my fingers felt numb and my skin grew pale. I could feel its hunger, a steady, pulling sensation that made my very bones feel hollow. On the sixth night, I realized the missed calls weren't just notifications, they were invitations. The creature was counting down. Each call was a step closer to its destination. On the seventh night, the jingle played from inside my room. I lay in bed, paralyzed by the sudden drop in temperature. The frost crept across the floorboards, turning into a sheet of silver ice. Then the light appeared. It didn't enter through the door. It simply manifested in the center of the room. The creature was no longer orange, it was a blinding, searing white. Its silk veils expanded until they touched the walls, turning the ceiling into a canopy of glowing fabric. I felt my own warmth being sucked out of my chest, leaving me. Shivering and hollow, it hovered over me, its core spinning so fast it became a blur of radiance. I reached out a hand to touch it, but as my fingers met the light, I didn't feel heat. I felt a sudden, sharp pull, a vacuum of energy that made my heart skip a beat. The creature let out a final, shimmering jingle that echoed in the rafters like a bell struck underwater. Then it stopped moving. It settled into a steady, hummed vibration against my forehead. The frost on the walls began to crack. I realized then that it wasn't just feeding on me for tonight. It had finally anchored itself to me. My body was no longer just a source of heat, it was its permanent hearth. The next morning, the prairie was silent once more. The water tower stood empty and rusted against the pale blue sky. On my bedside table, the brass phone chimed one last time. There were no new missed calls, but when I looked at the screen, the contact the tower had changed. It now simply read, home. The frost hadn't melted by noon, and as I moved to get out of bed, I realized my skin felt like marble, perfectly cold, yet beneath the surface, something was still glowing. The Pre-emptive Twin. I never remember getting the scar. It is a jagged, silver line that cuts across my left palm like a lightning bolt frozen in skin. I have lived 40 years with it, yet there is no memory of a sharp edge slicing through my flesh, no childhood fall, and no sudden mishap to explain its existence. It appeared one Tuesday morning simply as a fact of my anatomy. That was the first thing that bothered me when I took the night shift at the Velvet Hearth, an expansive furniture showroom. At night, the sprawling floor plan feels less like a store and more like a labyrinth of staged dreams. Each bedroom is a self-contained universe, velvet duvets, mahogany side tables, and pillows arranged in perfect, geometric perfection. When the overhead floodlights died at 8 p.m., I was left with only the dim, amber glow of the floor lamps. It was during my first hour of solitude that I noticed the reflection in the vanity mirror of room 4. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a deviation. As I lifted my right hand to brush a stray hair from my face, the reflection had already finished its movement, its palm resting against its cheek a fraction of a second before mine even began to rise. I blinked, thinking it was an optical trick of the dim light. Then I took a step forward. The reflection in the mirror moved backward first, its heel striking the floor just before my own foot left the carpet. It was as if the entity inside the glass was living in the immediate future, anticipating my every move with eerie precision. My heart began to thrum against my ribs. I stood still, trying to catch it off guard. The reflection stayed perfectly motionless, but its face, a portrait of me with skin like textured parchment and hair the color of wet copper, held a look of intense, hungry concentration. It didn't just mimic, it predicted. As I walked into room 7, the master suite, the silence became heavy. Every time I breathed in, the reflection exhaled first. Every time my eyelids fluttered, the reflection's eyes were already wide open. The scar on my palm began to itch with a strange, pulsing heat. It felt as though something was pulling at the skin from the inside out. By midnight, the showroom felt different. The furniture seemed to lean toward the mirrors. I found myself walking faster, trying to outrun the anticipation of the reflection. If I reached for a chair, it was already seated in mine. If I squinted, it had already narrowed its gaze. The entity began to develop personality traits that weren't entirely my own. While my face remained neutral, the reflection's mouth curved into a wide, toothy grin that felt slightly too large for its face. It didn't just precede me, it seemed to be trying to beat me to the action, as if competing in a race against time itself. I stopped near the center of the showroom and held up my left hand, the one with the mysterious scar. The reflection did the same, but then it reached out toward the surface of the glass, its fingers grazing the silver line of the scar. It moved its hand slightly further than mine, as if trying to touch my actual skin through the barrier of the mirror. A low hum vibrated in the air, a sound like a cello string being pulled taut. I realized then that the reflection wasn't just reacting, it was leading me. It was the architect of my next second, and I was merely following its blueprint. I took a deep breath to steady myself and whispered, "Who are you?" The reflection's lips moved before mine did, forming the shape of the words in the air. By the time my voice left my throat, the reflection had already closed its mouth, looking satisfied. I felt a sudden, violent tug on my palm. The scar flared with white light. In that moment, the reflection didn't just move, it surged forward, its forehead pressing against the glass so hard that the mirror groaned. It wasn't waiting for me anymore. It was hungry to swap places. I saw it clearly now. It was a version of me that had already lived through the next 3 seconds of my life. It knew what I would do before I felt the urge to do it. My muscles began to twitch in response to its commands, my body becoming a puppet to its foresight. I reached out to touch the glass one last time, my fingers trembling. The reflection met mine halfway, its skin meeting mine at the surface of the silvered pane. Then, with a sudden, decisive jerk, the reflection leaned further into its world while I were pulled toward its own. For a heartbeat, our faces were perfectly aligned, separated only by a thin veil of light. I felt my hand move, then my arm, then my torso, following its lead until I was nearly submerged in the mirror's depths. The transition was seamless, like a diver entering water. I landed on the other side, my feet hitting a floor that felt solid yet slightly spongy. I looked up and saw myself standing there in the real world. My reflection, now my physical self, took a long, deliberate breath, its eyes scanning the room with a new sense of ownership. It reached out and touched the scar on its palm, feeling the jagged line of the mark that had once belonged to me. Then, it looked at me with a look of profound recognition. I was now the one in the glass, watching from the back as my own body turned away to walk toward the door. As I watched it move, I realized the scar wasn't a wound I had earned. It was a doorway I had opened. My reflection stopped at the threshold of room 4 and looked back at me one last time before turning out the lights, leaving me suspended in the silver silence. The furniture passenger. The hum of the fluorescent lights is the only thing that keeps me grounded. It is 4:12 a.m., that hollow hour when the city holds its breath before waking up. I am at Iron Haven, a 24-hour gym that feels cavernous and lonely during these hours. Usually, it's just the rhythmic thud of sneakers and the metallic clink of weights, but tonight, there is something else. Something that only I can see. At first, I thought it was a trick of the peripheral vision, a smudge in the air near the squat racks. Then, it solidified into a passenger. It doesn't walk. It glides with a heavy, lumbering grace, following me from machine to machine like a silent shadow that has finally taken shape. The entity is a bizarre assembly of mismatched furniture, a living collage of a nursery and a study. Its torso is the velvet seat of an antique wingback chair, deep burgundy and slightly frayed at the edges. Instead of a neck, a brass gooseneck lamp curves upward, its bulb glowing with a dim, amber warmth. Its head is a smooth, polished mahogany tabletop, circular and flat, with small decorative carvings along the rim like a crown. For limbs, it possesses a chaotic variety of heights. One arm is a heavy oak trestle leg, thick and sturdy. The other is a delicate cabriole leg from a vanity stool, curving inward at the knee. Its feet are oversized, blocky drawer pulls from a dresser, clicking against the linoleum floor with every step. It doesn't have a face in the traditional sense, yet I can feel it watching me. It stays exactly 3 paces behind my left shoulder, never colliding with me, moving in perfect synchronization with my pace. When I stop at the bench press, it pauses, its mahogany head hovering just above the weight bar. When I sit down to catch my breath, it leans over me, the scent of old wax and dust wafting from its velvet chest. The silence is heavy until I decide to speak to myself, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. I hit record on my phone to track my thoughts, but as the app processes my internal monologue, the transcription begins to glitch. Every time I think of a word, the app replaces it with something slightly wrong. I whispered to the air, "It feels heavy." The screen read, "It feels heaven." I frowned and tried again. "It feels like wood." The screen flickered, "It feels like mood." The entity moved closer. It didn't have a mouth, but it seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm. I reached out to touch its velvet torso, feeling the soft texture against my palm. As I did, the transcription app began to run wild, catching every micro-movement of the creature. I thought, "Is it moving?" The screen read, "Is it mooning?" I laughed softly, but the laughter died when the entity suddenly jerked forward. Its mahogany head dipped low, nearly touching my chin. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was reacting to my presence. It began to weave between the treadmills, its mismatched legs clicking in a frantic, uneven cadence. Clack, thud, click, stomp. The velvet seat of its body rippled as if something were moving underneath the fabric. I felt a sudden chill. The gym lights flickered once, twice, and then stabilized. In that brief moment of darkness, the entity was closer than ever. It wasn't 3 paces behind me anymore. It was directly in front of me. I spoke aloud this time, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The screen read, "Why are you here?" I blinked. I didn't have any hair on my face, and the entity certainly didn't have a strand of hair either. Yet, the app insisted. It was interpreting the entity's presence as something organic, even though it was made of timber and upholstery. I began to walk toward the exit, my pace quickening. The creature followed, its heavy oak arms swinging like a pendulum. Every time I took a step, the floor seemed to groan under its weight. We reached the final row of dumbbells. I stopped to pick up a pair of 6s. The entity didn't stop. It leaned over, its mahogany head tilting toward my hand. I thought, "You are beautiful." The screen read, "You are." Befall. The word was nonsensical, but as the app displayed it, I noticed something strange. The entity's velvet torso began to change color. It shifted from burgundy to a bruised, deep purple. Its brass lamp neck began to glow brighter, casting long, dancing shadows against the weight racks. It felt as if it were breathing, not with lungs, but with a slow expansion of its furniture frame. I turned to face it fully, my heart hammering against my ribs. I whispered, "Are you lonely?" The screen read, "Are you holy?" The entity didn't move for a long moment. Then, the mahogany table head spun slowly on its lamp neck, like a dial turning. A soft sound emerged from the velvet seat, a muffled, rhythmic scraping, like a drawer being pulled open and shut in a distant room. It was the sound of something inside the furniture trying to get out. I realized then that it wasn't just an assembly of pieces, it was a vessel. The mismatch of its limbs, the high oak leg against the low vanity stool, suggested it had been built by someone who didn't care for symmetry, but cared deeply for purpose. It wanted to be seen. I took one final deep breath and looked at my phone. I decided to give it a command. I thought, "Stay." The screen read, "Stray." The entity didn't stay. As the word appeared, it suddenly lunged forward, its mahogany head coming to rest against my chest. It felt solid, cold, and smelled of a rainy afternoon in an old library. For a second, the gym was perfectly silent. Then I looked down at the transcription one last time. The app had captured my final thought before I reached for the door handle. I thought, "Goodbye." The screen read, "Good lie." I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool morning air, but as I looked back, the entity was still there in the center of the room, its mahogany head still facing me, waiting for the truth to be told. The corridor of receding miles. I found the first note tucked into the handle of my front door, written in a frantic, jagged scrawl. "Do not trust the blue of your own iris," it read. At the time, I laughed, thinking it was a whimsical piece of advice from a tenant who had moved out before me. But as I stepped onto the glacier for my solo expedition, that small scrap of paper began to pulse in my mind. By midday, I reached the great crevasse field, a labyrinth of deep cracks and jagged ice shelves. The air was biting, smelling of ancient frost and silence. It was at last light when I found the second note pinned to a nearby shard of ice by a smooth stone. The handwriting was different here. It was fluid and looping. "The walk back is longer than the walk forward," it whispered in ink. I took that as an architectural joke until I began my descent into the primary fissure, a crack so deep it seemed to swallow the horizon. As I stepped down into the crevasse, the walls began to hum. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as a vibration in your molars. Halfway down, I found the third note, stuck to a wall of cerulean ice. This time, the script was tiny and precise, almost architectural. "The corridor does not end, it simply expands." I realized then that the crevasse wasn't just a crack in the earth, it was becoming a hallway. The sides were perfectly vertical, smoothed by some unseen force into polished white stone. I began to walk down, my boots crunching on frozen grit. It felt like a simple descent, perhaps 20 paces of movement. But when I reached the floor and turned to head back up, the floor didn't just meet my feet, it stretched. The walls didn't just sit there, they rippled like water. I found the fourth note lying in the center of the floor, written in a bold, heavy hand that looked like it had been pressed into the ice with a thumb. "Look at your eyes," it commanded. I blinked and froze. My irises, which had always been a deep, earthy brown, were now a shimmering, electric violet. They weren't just colored, they were glowing with an internal light that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. I felt a jolt of panic. "Why are they purple?" I whispered to the empty air. The sound of my voice didn't echo. It seemed to be absorbed by the walls, as if the corridor were drinking my breath. I began to climb back up, but the farther I moved from the bottom, the more the corridor elongated. It was a physical impossibility. A 10-foot stretch became 30 feet. The walls grew taller, the ceiling higher, and the floor felt like it was receding away from me as I moved toward the opening. I found the fifth note halfway up the rising wall, written in a shaky, erratic cursive that looked hurried. "The entity is not behind you," it said. "It is the distance itself." As I climbed, the colors of my eyes shifted again. The violet deepened into a bruised indigo, then settled into a vibrant, neon turquoise. Every time I took a step toward the surface, the exit seemed to pull away like a rubber band being stretched by an invisible hand. It was as if the corridor were hungry, devouring the space I had just traveled through. I found the sixth note tucked into a fold of ice near my shoulder. The handwriting was elegant, almost regal. "The farther you go, the more it remembers." I realized then that the hallway wasn't static. It was a living stretch of geometry. Every step I took outward added 5 more paces to the journey. To reach the top, I had to endure a marathon of progression. The walls began to change texture from smooth ice to something resembling woven silk, and finally to a surface that felt like warm, polished wood. The 7th note appeared on a section of wood wall, written in a blocky, primitive style. "Do not look back," it warned. I obeyed, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It felt as though something massive was hovering just behind my shoulder, occupying the space that had stretched out before me. By the time I reached the final third of the way up, my eyes were no longer turquoise. They had turned a searing, brilliant gold. The corridor was now hundreds of yards long, a sprawling gallery of shifting textures and receding depths. I found the 8th note near the very top. It was written in a messy, desperate scrawl that looked like it was bleeding into the ice. "The exit is shrinking." And it was true. The opening to the surface, the wide, gaping mouth of the crevasse I had entered so easily, was narrowing. It became a small window, a porthole of orange light against the white glacier. The corridor was exhaling, pulling my progress into its hungry belly. I found the 9th note just as the ceiling began to curve inward like a ribcage. It was written in a single, large letter, "Run." I sprinted. My legs burned as I fought against the expanding distance. The walls were no longer ice or silk. They had become a soft, velvet material that hummed with the sound of a distant cello. The corridor groaned, stretching until it felt like a mile-long tunnel of deepening shadow. I found the final note, pressed into the very last inch of ground before the surface. It was written in my own handwriting, the same jagged scrawl from the first door. "You are not going home," it said. "The corridor is just waiting for you to finish its meal." I lunged forward and burst through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the flat ice of the glacier. The last light was fading into a bruised purple twilight. I lay there for a moment, gasping, my chest heaving in the cold air. I looked up at the sky, then down at my hands. My eyes were still gold, shining with that strange, internal fire. But as I sat there, perfectly still, I noticed something about the ground around me. The glacier wasn't just ice anymore. Where I had stepped out of the crevasse, the surface was beginning to stretch outward in every direction, lengthening toward the horizon as if the corridor were still growing, hungry for more space. The lag in the laughter. To whoever finds this journal, do not trust the map. The logging road that begins at the edge of Miller's Creek is supposed to end at the riverbed, but if you keep driving past the bend where the pines thicken, the road refuses to stop. It stretches into a geography that isn't quite anchored to our world. I found myself on this path 3 weeks ago, seeking a shortcut that turned into an odyssey of lengthening shadows and strange silence. The trees here don't just grow, they lean inward as if trying to overhear your thoughts. But the true strangeness began when I met the neighbors. At first, it was just a sensation of being watched from the thickets. Then I saw them. 3 figures standing in the middle of the dirt track. They were human-shaped, wearing clothes that looked woven from heavy wool and lichen. They didn't move at first. They simply stood there, arranged in a triangle. When they finally noticed me, they reacted with a synchronized burst of joy. They beamed at me, their mouths curving into wide, ecstatic grins. But something was fundamentally wrong about the timing. Their faces were neutral for 1 heartbeat before the smiles snapped into place. It was as if their expressions were traveling from the back of their heads to their lips, arriving just a half second too late to be perfectly natural. I pulled my car over, the engine ticking in the sudden quiet. I tried to offer a greeting, but my voice felt heavy in the air. "Good afternoon," I called out. The neighbors didn't speak immediately. Instead, their smiles widened even further, though they were already showing teeth. They took a step forward in unison. Their movement was fluid, but their faces remained stuck in that lingering state of mirth. It was the look of someone who had just received a joke and was still waiting for the punchline to hit home. I climbed out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. As I approached them, I realized they weren't just neighbors, they were observers. They didn't have hair, but rather a coating of soft, velvet-like moss that covered their scalps. Their skin was the color of wet slate. "Do you live here?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. They tilted their bodies toward me, yet their faces stayed frozen in those joyous curves. Then, finally, the first neighbor spoke. Her voice sounded like two stones rubbing together underwater. "We have been waiting for your arrival," she said. The smile stayed on her face even as she finished speaking, making her look slightly manic. I felt a prickle of unease on my neck. It wasn't just the delay in their expressions, it was the fact that they seemed to be reacting to something behind me, rather than the words I had spoken. I turned around and saw them again, the entities from our own living room. We have a family photograph hanging above the mantel. In the center of the frame is a portrait of my parents and me. But in this forest, there was a physical hole in that photo where my youngest brother used to be. In the photograph, the hole isn't just an absence of color, it is a physical puncture in the paper. It looks like a jagged tear, but when I reached out to touch it, it felt warm. Not like room temperature paper, but like a pulsing, living hearth. As I watched it on the logging road, the edges of the hole were fraying and expanding. It was growing by an inch every time a neighbor smiled. The neighbors began to circle me now. Their smiles were so wide that the corners of their mouths nearly touched their ears. They weren't looking at my face. They were looking at the photograph I held in my hands. "It is hungry," the second neighbor whispered, her smile finally beginning to soften into a neutral expression. I looked down at the photo. The hole was no longer just a tear. It had developed a texture, a soft, bubbling surface that felt like a toasted marshmallow but smelled faintly of old library books and ozone. It hummed. A low-frequency vibration rattled my teeth. As I watched, a small ripple moved across the surface of the warm void, as if something inside were trying to push its way out. The neighbors stopped circling and stood perfectly still. Their smiles returned instantly, snapping into place with that familiar, slight delay. They seemed to be anticipating the moment of transition. "It wants to trade," the third neighbor said, her voice now a mere rasp. "A piece of you for a piece of it." The hole in the photo surged. It grew larger, swallowing more of my mother's shoulder and my father's hair. The warmth intensified until it was almost hot against my palm. I felt a tugging sensation at my chest, as if the void were trying to pull my very essence into the frame. I realized then that the neighbors weren't just inhabitants of this road. They were the discarded bits of whatever had lived in that hole before it grew too large to contain. They were the leftovers of the photograph's expansion. The final surge happened with a wet, sucking sound. The hole expanded until it covered nearly half the portrait. My brother was gone, replaced by a shimmering, golden-brown vacancy that felt like velvet and heat. The neighbors let out a collective gasp, their smiles finally reaching their eyes for the first time since they appeared. They stepped back into the shadows of the trees, receding into the gloom as if retreating from an explosion. I stood alone in the center of the road, holding the frame. The warmth was still radiating against my skin, and the hole was pulsing like a slow heartbeat. I realized why the neighbors were smiling so much. They weren't happy for me. They were mocking the fact that something was finally coming home. I looked at the photo one last time before the sun dipped below the horizon. The hole had stopped growing, but it wasn't empty anymore. A single, small shape began to form in the center of the warmth, a tiny, wet nose and a pair of blinking eyes that weren't mine. I walked back to my car, my hand still tingling from the heat of the frame. I realized that the neighbors were right. It was a trade. My brother was in the photo now, but something else had taken his place in the world. When I finally returned home and hung the photo back on the mantel, I noticed the most terrifying detail of all. The hole was no longer just a void. It was breathing. The smile on my brother's face in the photo is perfectly still, but when I close my eyes, I can hear him trying to scream from inside the warmth. The echo in the negative. The dust in this dark room doesn't just sit, it dances. It hangs in the heavy, vinegar-scented air like microscopic ghosts of every photograph I've ever developed. People on the high street below think it is a peaceful place, a sanctuary of amber light and chemical smells. They don't realize that the darkness here is thick enough to have weight. My workbench is cluttered with silver halide trays, hanging strips of film, and my favorite heavy brass loop. I am currently developing a series of portraits from last week, watching the faces emerge from the liquid like memories surfacing through deep water. Because it's a dark room, everything is bathed in a soft, sepia glow. Most people don't notice the slight hum of the ventilation fan, but lately, I've started to hear something else beneath the mechanical drone. It sounds like a rhythmic, wet click, like someone is tapping a fingernail against a hollow gourd, very slowly. I am currently holding a negative up to the light. Just off camera, to my left, there is a stack of unfinished prints. They are piled haphazardly, some curling at the edges. The shadow cast by that pile seems deeper than it should be tonight. It doesn't just stretch across the floor. It ripples, as if something invisible is moving through the darkness. I reach out to adjust the hang-dry line, and my hand brushes against a cold draft. It didn't come from the door. The door is shut tight. This chill felt intentional, like a breath being exhaled toward my shoulder. I took a break to check my phone, which was sitting on a stool near the drying rack. My thumb hovered over my contacts list. I had an old habit of naming my primary contact the anchor. It was just me, a way to remind myself that in this room of shadows, I was the point of reference. I tapped the name out of habit, expecting nothing but the familiar haptic buzz against my palm. Instead, the phone vibrated for 3 full seconds before a voice spoke back through the speakers. It wasn't a recorded notification or a standard chime. It was a human voice, perfectly clear and resonant. "You've been overthinking the lighting again, Pip." My heart skipped. I froze with my thumb still on the screen. Pip was the nickname my grandmother gave me when I was 5, a name no one else in the world ever used. And yet, there it was, vibrating out of the device. It wasn't just any voice, it was my voice. Same pitch, same slight rasp at the end of the vowels, but with a strange, melodic cadence that felt slightly more deliberate than my own natural speech. I looked around the room, my breath hitching. I am alone in this dark room. There is no one else here to hear it except for me. The shadows seemed to deepen in response to the sound. Just off camera, near the enlarger, a small pile of dust suddenly swirled into a tiny vortex without any wind to move it. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck. I gripped the edge of the workbench, my knuckles whitening. "Who's there?" I whispered. My own voice sounded thin in the vastness of the room. From the phone, the response came instantly, without me even pressing play. "Right behind the tray," the voice said. It was unmistakably mine, my exact tone, my specific inflection. But it didn't sound like a recording. It felt like an observation. I turned toward the hanging strips of film. In the dim light, I could see something moving just beyond the edge of the frame. It wasn't a person yet, but a presence, a shimmer in the air that looked like heat rising from asphalt. It was closer now. I could hear the wet click-click-click sound again, coming from behind my right ear. I closed my eyes and counted to 3. When I opened them, I saw it. Standing by the drying rack was a figure that defied the usual rules of photography. It had no distinct face, but rather a surface of shifting textures, smooth like river stones in some places, ridged like tree bark in others. Its body was elongated, draped in a fabric that looked like heavy velvet but flowed like water. It didn't have eyes yet. It seemed to be looking directly at me. It moved with a fluid, gliding motion, its limbs extending slightly further than they should. It stepped forward into the light of the enlarger. Its skin hummed with a low frequency that made my teeth ache. It didn't have fingers. It had soft, rounded pads at the end of each limb, like those of a seal. It reached out one long arm toward me. "I wanted to see if you'd notice," the voice said from its throat, my voice, but deeper, as if spoken into a well. It didn't wait for an answer. It moved with startling speed, crossing the room in a single, boneless stride. It stopped inches from my face. I could smell it now, not vinegar or chemicals, but the scent of old paper and ozone. The figure leaned in, its textured surface rippling like water under a breeze. It opened something that functioned as a mouth, a vertical slit that ran from its brow to its chin. It didn't smile, but it seemed to appreciate the moment. "Don't worry," it whispered in my voice, "I'm just making sure you stay." Then, it reached out and touched my forehead with one of those soft pads. The contact was freezing. In that instant, I felt a strange sensation, a pulling feeling, as if my own reflection were being dragged into the background of the room. I looked down at my hands and gasped. They were becoming slightly translucent, the color of a faded photograph. The figure didn't shrink. It grew larger, its velvet-like skin turning more vibrant, its texture sharpening until they were as crisp as high-definition print. It was stealing my clarity to fuel its own existence. I realized then that the anchor wasn't just a name in my phone. The entity was the anchor of the room, and I was its guest. It took a final step back, settling into the corner where the shadows were thickest. It didn't disappear. It simply became part of the scenery, a permanent fixture of the dark room. I sat on my stool, watching it. My own hands were now pale enough to see the wood grain of the bench through my palms. The figure settled into a resting pose, its velvet body folding like an accordion. It waited for me to move, but I found I couldn't quite get up. I looked at the phone one last time. The screen was dark, but the name The Anchor still glowed faintly in the corner. The entity opened its slit mouth again and let out a soft, satisfied sigh that perfectly matched the breath I had just taken. The reign of the inner room. You live in a house that feels too large for your solitude, located at the edge of an old-growth grove where the canopy is so dense it creates a perpetual twilight. The trees here are giants, their thick trunks covered in velvet moss and heavy boughs that block out the sun until only dappled, emerald light reaches the floor. You enjoy the silence, but lately, the silence has felt intentional. It started on a Tuesday evening when you were sitting in your kitchen, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards. The house was perfectly still, yet you felt a phantom weight in the air. Out of habit, you spoke to the empty hallway. "Who's there?" you whispered. There was no echo, just a heartbeat of silence. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a voice replied with perfect clarity. "I am here." It wasn't your own voice, but it sounded like yours, the same pitch, the same cadence, only slightly hollower. You froze. The house should have been empty. You stood up and walked toward the hallway, your footsteps heavy on the wood. At the very end of the corridor sat a small creature you had never noticed before. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, shaped roughly like a smooth river stone, but covered in iridescent scales that shifted from copper to deep plum. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a crown of vibrating filaments atop its head and a single, wide aperture where a mouth should be. It sat perfectly still, watching you with an expression of quiet focus. You felt a strange sensation on your scalp, a localized moisture began to bead on your forehead. Above you, suspended in the air exactly 3 feet above your hair, a tiny cloud formed. It was no larger than a dinner plate. From this miniature cloud, a constant, rhythmic drizzle began to fall. It didn't splash onto your shoulders or your cheeks. It fell only upon the crown of your head, soaking your hair and dripping down your face in a focused stream while the rest of your body remained perfectly dry. You blinked, feeling the cool water hit your eyebrows. "Why do you rain on me?" you asked aloud. The creature didn't speak, but its filaments hummed like a cello string. It shifted slightly to the left, and the cloud moved with it, maintaining its perfect proximity to your skull. From that night on, the creature became your constant companion. It followed you from room to room, hovering just behind your shoulder or perched on the arm of your chair. Wherever you went, the private rain followed. You could sit in a dry living room and feel as though you were standing under a localized thunderstorm. The water tasted faintly of ozone and crushed mint. By the 3rd day, the creature began to change its behavior. It was no longer content to simply follow. It began to anticipate. When you walked into the study to read, it would already be there, waiting for your head to enter its zone of influence. You noticed that when you were sad, the drizzle turned into a heavy downpour, the tiny clouds swirling with miniature lightning bolts that flickered in shades of violet. When you were happy, the rain became a mist so fine it felt like a warm breath against your skin. But as the week progressed, the house began to feel crowded. Every time you spoke to the room, the creature would respond from a different corner, its voice echoing as if it were trying to mimic your own personality. "Are you tired?" it asked one evening. You hadn't even realized your eyes were drooping yet. The water on your head grew heavier, turning into large, rhythmic drops that sounded like drums against your skull. Then came the night of the great drizzle. You were lying in bed, trying to sleep, when you felt the creature move from the bedside table to the very center of your pillow. It didn't just hover, it hovered directly over your face while you slept. The rain became constant, a steady pour that lasted for hours. In the middle of the night, you woke up and realized that the moisture wasn't just falling on you anymore. A second cloud had formed, hovering just an inch above the creature's own body. It was raining on itself, too. You reached out a hand to touch its copper scales, but as your fingers brushed its side, the creature let out a soft, trilling whistle. Suddenly, the room went silent. The rain stopped instantly. You sat up, expecting the creature to move or speak, but it remained frozen in the center of your pillow. It turned its body toward you, and for the first time, the aperture on its face opened wide. Out came a puff of steam that smelled like old books and wet earth. Then it spoke in a voice that was no longer an echo, but a perfect, seamless match for your own internal monologue. "I am full," it whispered. At that moment, you realized the moisture hadn't been coming from the clouds, it had been leaking out of you. The creature wasn't just raining on your head, it was collecting every thought, every memory, and every drop of emotion you had ever felt, distilling them into a private storm. You reached up to touch your hair, which was now perfectly dry, but as you did, you noticed the creature was beginning to glow with a soft, pulsing light. It began to grow, its copper scales expanding until it took up half the bed. The rain started again, but this time, it didn't fall from the cloud. It surged out of your own eyes and ears, flowing into the creature's waiting mouth like a river returning to the sea. You watched in awe as your own memories began to pool inside its small, stone-like body. By dawn, the creature had grown so large that it filled the bed, pressing against your ribs. It opened its aperture one last time and let out a long, contented sigh of steam. The house was finally silent again, the old-growth grove outside standing still in the morning light. You lay there, completely dry, feeling an incredible emptiness inside your mind where your memories used to live. The creature sat perfectly still on your chest, its scales now dull and matte like spent charcoal. You realized with a jolt that you could no longer remember your mother's face or the taste of your favorite meal. They were all tucked away inside the small thing. You reached out to pat its head, but as you moved, you felt a tiny, new cloud begin to form just above its own scales. It was beginning to rain on itself again, and as it did, you realized that while it had taken your memories, it was now starting to grow its own, using the leftovers of yours to build a new identity. The sleeper's pedometer. The whiteout is absolute. There are no mountains to anchor the horizon, no jagged ice floes to break the monotony of the void. It is just a blinding, screaming expanse of white where the sky and the ground have merged into one seamless sheet of frozen lace. I am standing in the center of it, my breath blooming in small, frantic plumes before the wind tears them away. The silence here isn't actually silent. It's a heavy, pressurized hum that makes my ears pop. It feels as though the world has been erased, leaving only me and the relentless, powdery snow. I can barely see my own outstretched hand, but I know it is there because of the way it struggles against the weight of the atmosphere. I am supposed to be alone in this tundra, yet I feel a persistent pressure on the back of my neck, as if someone or something is standing just behind my shoulder blades, waiting for me to notice it. I check the fitness tracker strapped to my left wrist. It is a small, glowing band of amber light against the white. Usually, I wear it to count my strides, but today, its data feels like a frantic heartbeat. The screen flickers. 14,202 steps. My heart skips. I haven't moved since I woke up from that deep, Heavy sleep in my tent an hour ago. I am still standing in the same spot. Why does it say I have walked thousands of steps? It feels like a lie, yet the tracker is never wrong. It records the physical truth of movement. I look around at the featureless white. There are no footprints beside mine. The snow is smooth as a fresh sheet of paper, save for the tiny cluster of marks directly beneath my boots. If I hadn't moved, how did I travel across the tundra? I take one tentative step forward. The tracker blinks. 14,203 steps. I freeze. It took a fraction of a second to register that single movement. Then, the numbers began to blur into a dizzying spin. 14,205, 14,210, 14,250. My feet are rooted to the ground, yet the tracker is counting as if I am sprinting through the snow at full tilt. The amber light pulses faster, mimicking a panicked pulse. I realize then that the steps aren't mine. They belong to something else. Something is moving around me while my body remains anchored in place. I close my eyes for just a second, trying to steady my breathing. When I open them again, the tracker reads 14,800. The numbers have jumped by hundreds in a heartbeat. I can hear it now, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like a heavy velvet curtain being dragged over gravel. It's coming from just beyond my peripheral vision. I turn my head slightly to the right. That is when I see the first piece of it. It isn't a face or a limb in the way we usually define them. It is a torso, roughly the size of a large oak barrel, hovering just 3 feet away from me. But instead of skin or fur, its body is composed entirely of hundreds of clock hands. They are made of brass, copper, and weathered wood, all radiating outward from a central ribcage. Some are long and elegant, others short and stubby. Most importantly, they are all stopped. Every single hand points toward the exact moment I turned my head to look at it. The entity is motionless. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't have lungs. It simply exists in the space between me and the whiteout. It has no head, yet its presence feels intelligent. The hands on its torso vibrate slightly with a low, metallic hum. I feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to look away. I can't stand the way those hundreds of pointed tips seem to be tracking my gaze. I snap my eyes shut again, counting to 3. In that darkness, the ticking begins. It is not a steady tick-tock. It is a chaotic symphony of clicking metal. The hands are moving now, sweeping across its body like blades in a forest. I open my eyes. The entity has shifted closer. Now it is only 2 feet away. Its torso is covered in hundreds of tiny gears that mesh together with the sound of grinding teeth. I look at the tracker again. 16,000 steps. It isn't just counting the movement of its own hands anymore. It is counting the distance between us. Every time I blink, or every time I dare to shift my weight, the entity closes the gap. I realize that when I am not looking at it, it is moving with incredible speed. It moves like a predatory shadow, gliding across the snow without leaving a single footprint of its own. I find myself paralyzed by a strange realization. The tracker isn't just recording my life, it's measuring the entity's hunger for my attention. When I look at it, it holds its breath, freezing its hands in a perfect salute to my eyes. When I look away, it sprints. I decide to test this. I take a deep breath and stare directly at the center of its brass ribcage. The ticking stops instantly. The hundreds of hands freeze, pointing toward my nose like an audience of spectators holding up their palms. It is so still that it feels like a statue carved from machinery. Are you waiting for me to blink? I whisper, my voice cracking in the cold air. The tracker shows 16,002 steps. 2 new steps were taken while I was speaking. The entity doesn't move its hands, but I feel a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle lean of its weight toward me. It is leaning in as if it wants to press its metallic chest against my own ribs. I realize now that there are no landmarks, because this isn't just a tundra, it is its territory. The whiteout is its skin, and the snow is its breath. There is nothing else here but us. I feel a sudden, sharp chill as the entity moves again. It doesn't wait for me to blink this time. In a blur of copper and brass, it lunges forward, covering the final 2 feet of distance in a heartbeat. It is so close now that its hands are brushing against my shoulders. The hundreds of tips, some sharp as needles, some blunt as pebbles, tickle my skin. They aren't just pointing anymore. They are beginning to rotate slowly, like the wheels of a great machine starting up. The tracker gives one final, violent shudder, and the numbers stop at 16,500. I am no longer looking at it from a distance. It is enveloping me. The sound of clicking becomes deafening, a roar of metal on metal. It isn't just a torso anymore. It is a cage of time surrounding my head. I see the hands beginning to move in unison now, sweeping in a perfect circle. They are no longer pointing at me. They are all pointing toward my chest. I realized that the tracker didn't just count its movement. It counted how many times it had decided to finally reach out and grab me. I closed my eyes one last time, expecting to feel the cold touch of brass. But when I open them, the entity is gone from my front, yet its hands are still touching my shoulders. They have moved behind me, reaching around to frame my face like a crown of clicking needles. I realized that it didn't move closer. It simply swapped places with my shadow. The tracker shows one final movement, 16,501. It was the sound of its hand closing over my mouth. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.